Constantius makes it easier by essentially wiping out all of his cousins or any of his secondary family that would kind of pose a threat. No, that's Gallus. We'll get to him here shortly, but
Sorry, just a second.
no worries.
Okay.
So that guy.
Guy in the middle, old big nose there. So he wipes out the majority of his cousins, and immediately after the funeral, and so then him and his brothers meet and discuss who gets what. And so Constantius, being the oldest, decides that he would like the Eastern Empire, so he takes on the Eastern Empire. And then Constance gets, essentially, being the youngest, he gets Rome and Greece and in North Africa. And then Constantine gets the Western Empire, so most of Europe and Britannia. So things are moving along, and then Constantine decides, well, he doesn't have a steady food supply because the Western Empire gets a lot of their supply from Egypt and Africa. So he tells his younger brother Constance, hey, I want a part of your territory. And Constance opposes him. So things get heated, and also during this time, the church and state become even more intertwined, and politics starts becoming very prominent within the churches, especially since Constantius was a Arian sympathizer. Anybody who remember who the Arians were?
They were in Africa.
White people.
Yeah, they were in Africa, Alexandria. What was their view on the Messiah?
Didn't they believe that the Messiah wasn't God?
That's right.
Positive.
Yeah, so Constantius followed the Arian viewpoint. So yeah, they believed that Christ was, purely man. That wasn't really a divine figure, and then his brothers were more pro-Nicene supporters. So they had basically propped up, the bishops in their own region to kind of amplify their religious and political viewpoints. So one of those guys was, if you remember, Athanasius, who was excommunicated by Constantine I because he was very zealous for the Nicene Creed. So he even went as far as killing some Christian, followers that did not adhere to the Nicene Creed. And so Constantine, his goal was unity, so this guy was kind of causing disunity, so he excommunicated him. Well, so now, so here we have Constance and Constantine, kind of things are getting heated. Finally, Constantine decides that he's going to march on his brother to Rome, so he's preparing to make his way towards Rome, and then he's ambushed by, I think they were Franks. So Constance doesn't have to worry about dealing with his brother, so Constantine is killed and is now out of the picture. So now, essentially, Constance takes over the Western Empire, But Constance, similar to Constantine, his brother, was a pro-Nicene sympathizer, so he decides that, now's the time to reinstate Athanasius, and so he brings Athanasius back into Rome. And given that Constantius was an Arian supporter, he tells his brother, that you need to basically kick this guy out. He's not supposed to be part of Rome. Dad kicked him out, so what are you doing? And so things start getting heated between those two, and then gets to the point where Constance says, either you recognize Athanasius and allow him to, take a bishopric in Rome, or I'm going to march on you. And so Constantius is busy dealing with the Persians. Constantine, prior to his death, had basically, beat the war drum against the Persians, and then when the Persians saw that Constantine died and his son took over, they thought, now would be a good time to go up against Rome. So Constantius thought he got, the better side of the deal, but ended up basically having to deal with the war as soon as he took his position. So he's busy dealing with the Persians, so he realizes, he doesn't have the army, the military to deal with his brother, so he decides to allow Athanasius to obtain a bishopric position. And then eventually Constance becomes kind of Machiavellian and surrounds himself with a makeshift guard made out of, really handsome archers, and decides to ignore the military and the royal guard. So they become Constance. That's Constance right here. Yeah, so he gets this entourage of pretty boys. And so
I just want to know what they think. Like, if they were standing here hundreds, thousands years later, listening to the story of their lives.
yeah.
They got reduced to pretty boys.
Yeah.
With big nose.
They'd probably have my head, so.
That guy looked like he took a selfie with the front camera.
At least old trick. So the military is not very pleased with Constance, and so one of the generals in the military decides to take it upon himself to fix the situation. So Magnentius essentially claims Caesar of the Western Empire. And so when Constance gains word of this, he decides to confront with his, entourage of archers. Obviously, the military makes short work of Chris Hemsworth style archers. So they flee. Constance flees, and Magnentius eventually, his military eventually captures Constance and executes him. So then Constantius gets word that one of the generals has killed his brother, and so there's not much he can do about it at this point because he's still dealing with Persia. And so Magnentius starts gaining popularity amongst the military. And so Constantius's sister, Constantina, and I've got to find his name. I had it here. Decides that there's another general who has been, was really loyal to Constantine, so he would be a good asset for Constantius. So she says, hey, have this guy named Vetranio claim Augustus over the west, and use him to basically limit the power of Magnentius. So Vetriano is successful in not defeating Magnentius, but at least keeping his power at bay. And then eventually, Constantius and Persia find a point where, Persia finds itself dealing with the enemy from the north, essentially Iraqis, and so Shapur II decides to enter into a peace agreement with Rome, with Constantius, so he can deal with the Iraqis. So obviously Constantius immediately jumps on the peace agreement because he's got other things to deal with. So they enter a peace treaty, and so then he takes this opportunity to march west and deal with Magnentius. And then on the way, he kind of sees Vetranio as a threat because he's gaining popularity, but Vetranio, knowing that his head's kind of at stake, he decides to step down. So he volunteers to step down and allow Constantius to take over. So Constantius goes against Magnentius, defeats him, and then he sets up his brother-in-law, Gallus, as kind of an interim Caesar of the West. So Constantina's husband is set up. And then Athanasius, who you remember is the pro-Nicene bishop, he's excommunicated again, and a second time. So then Gallus started to, his territory was struggling financially, and so he decided to persecute pagans, and especially the rich pagans. And so this started causing disunity in the empire, and so Constantius sent an entourage to confront Gallus on what he was doing, and Gallus essentially executed his Constantius's entourage, and then proceeded to blame it on his wife. Said it was her idea, it was your sister's idea, and obviously this threw Constantius into a rage, and so he kills Gallus. So then in the meantime, we have the Alemanni encroaching in the west, on the Western Empire, and so enter in Julian the Apostate. And I'll get into why he's called the Apostate. So immediately following the family massacre that Constantius conducted, Julian was shipped off to live with his grandmother, where his education was overseen by Bishop Eusebius, who was the individual who baptized Constantine. And so he was under the tutelage of Eusebius until Eusebius' death. And then afterwards, Julian was essentially exiled to Cappadocia, where he spent his time reading books, and he became enamored with Greek philosophy. So once Julian became an adult, he traveled as much as he could, observing corruption and greed amongst the church and the state, learning from masters of philosophy, rhetoric, and even magic. So, from his travels by 351 AD, Julian had become an anti-theist, and maybe the fact that his devout Christian cousin Constantius had murdered his entire family except for his brother had, something to do with it. So, here's a guy, young man who's, essentially witnessing the greatness of, the Catholic Church and the corruption and then obviously his whole family's killed by his cousin. So he decides to denounce God and become an anti-theist. So after his brother's death, Julian was called. So Gallus was Julian's brother. So after his brother's death, Julian was called to the Italian capital, where he was kept under house arrest until the emperor could meet him, size him up, and see if he was a threat to and see if he was competent to take on Caesar. And so in late 355, Julian was made Caesar of the Western Empire. So immediately after this bookworm was sent off to Gaul to deal with the Alemanni and the Franks. So Julian was essentially, marching to his death because he had no military experience. He's basically, like I said, a bookworm, a geek, and he's got no respect by the military. And so he's sent to, one of the most active, war zones in Rome. So, so he arrives. No, that was between Persia and Rome. So the Alemanni are like a mixed group of Germans along the Danube. So he marches north. And so he arrives thinking that, either he's going to be assassinated by Germans or killed by, the military, who are, especially those up in Germany, are some of the most seasoned veterans that Rome has. And so, here is this the military sees this, young kid show up, and they're essentially being led by a greenhorn, and he's an anti-theist, and he's skinny and pale, and he carries around a bunch of books. So things weren't looking good for Julian to begin with. So Julian took to his task head on. He spent his days training with his troops and working out. After several months, he went on his first march against the Germans along the Lower Rhine and was successful in pushing them back. And then soon after, Julian found himself and his army surrounded in a siege that they were unable to break out of. So Julian reached out to one of his generals, Marcellus, to support, who was, essentially 2 towns over. And Marcellus refused to come to Julian's aid. And he gave a number of excuses as to why. So instead of giving up or trying to escape, Julian stayed and led the efforts, allowing him and his troops to eventually overcome the siege. So time and time again, Julian struggled with generals who refused to take orders from the greenhorn, causing Julian to lose some battles that would have been easily won. Especially if his generals followed his strategies, because if nothing else, Julian was really smart, very strategic. So this went on until Julian defeated the king of the Alemanni and his army, with Julian and his soldiers unsupported and severely undermanned. So the German army demanded that the king and his chiefs dismount from their horses. So it was kind of a, the Germans are warring against Julian and his military, and their king and chiefs are, riding into battle with the German army, but they're, riding on the horses, and the Germans, they're still kind of new to this unified, Alemanni group, and so they're a little jealous and frustrated that, who are these guys that they think that they get horses and we have to march into battle. So they demand the king and his chiefs get off their horses and march with them, and so they do. And this allowed Julian to take advantage. For one, when you're not on horses and part of the massive military, it's hard to communicate and issue commands, and so they were a little disorganized, and so this kind of led to Julian eventually overtaking the Germans with a combination attack of cavalry, infantry, and his so his cavalry and his infantry. So they defeat the Germans. So this was called the Battle of Strasbourg, and this would basically cement Julian's reputation as a leader, and immediately following the battle, his men would have named him Augustus. So all his men, changed their viewpoint on Julian and wanted to immediately name him Caesar. So this is prior to him being, not Caesar, Augustus, which is, basically Constantius's. So if you remember, at this point, from the Tetrarchy, the Augustus was basically the head honcho, and then the Caesars were kind of his underlings. So
What pops into the mind is Luke chapter 2, when it talks about the census and it talks about Caesar Augustus. How does that word play with what you're saying?
So at that point, there was no distinction between Augustus, Caesar. So there was only a sole emperor. So the differentiation came out of Diocletian and his tetrarch. So when he set up, he saw, and it was hard to manage such a vast empire. So he set up basically Caesars underneath him to manage the territories of Rome. But he remained Augustus. Yeah. So obviously, after his men are calling for Julian to take on Augustus, Julian saw this as a threat to his life, because Constantius had a temper, and he wouldn't have a competing Augustus. So Julian immediately quashed the idea, telling his men that only his cousin was Augustus, and that he would not tolerate his men elevating him in opposition to Constantius. So, of course his men are going to listen, right? So for a time, they did, but eventually 2 years after, the Battle of Strasbourg, this same announcement had made its way through the majority of the Western Empire. So in order to appease his men, he decided to listen to him, and so he took the title of Augustus. So this obviously dissolves the relationship between Julian and Constantius. So with a number of successful wins against the Germans and pushing him out of Roman territory, and now with the title of Augustus, Julian turned his focus on to his civil duties. So the first thing he noticed when he started digging into the books was that Rome had implemented tons of tax proclamations, allowing the wealthy upper class to enjoy the loopholes found in these proclamations. And so the wealthy went years without having to pay any taxes, putting the burden on the middle and lower class. So should sound kind of familiar with our simplified tax codes, right? So Julian removed the majority of the proclamation and made the wealthy pay taxes. So this reduced the overall tax rate by 2/3. The result was a double boon. So the lower and middle class thrived because they were paying a lot less taxes, and the tax revenue increased because the wealthy now paid taxes. So now not only had Julian gained the favor of his military, minus some of the older generals, but he also gained significant support and favor from the Western citizens, especially middle and lower class. So, of course, this came as a threat to Constantius. So with Constantius busy fighting Shapur and the Sassanids, how long would it be before Julian took the opportunity to march east and overtake Constantius? So most of this was, whispered in Constantius's ears by his court, but not only did the generals dislike Julian, but so did the imperial court. So here you have, the war kind of kicked off again. So Constantius is back dealing with the Persians, and so his court, in the background is, they dislike Julian, so they're like, hey, Julian over here, who's also Augustus, is looking to take advantage of your, now that your attention is on the Persians, he's looking to march east and take advantage of that, when Julian wasn't really interested at all in going to war with Constantius. So in 360, Constantius II sent a letter to Julian demanding that he and his army march east to help with the Persians, and probably with the purpose of, one, showing Julian that Constantius was still in charge, and two, he demanded that the troops most loyal to Julian be sent east, removing the majority of his military support from the equation. So he wanted Julian to send his most loyal troops out to Persia, basically to die, so that Julian wouldn't have much support from his military. Julian refused the order, and over the next year, he would deal with Constantius in the background so Julian refuses the order, and so in the background, Constantius is kind of dealing with the Germans and, sending out propaganda to stir up the Germans against Julian again. So after holding off the Germans, Julian took on the offensive against Constantius' military and marched east. Around the same time, Constantius was able to secure a peace treaty with Shapur again, and so Constantius gathered up his military and marched west. And Rome was in for another epic civil war, except during the march west, Constantius fell ill, but refused to stop the march. But by the end of the next day, Constantius died at 44. So Constantius had been Augustus for 24 years. So now, sole ruler of Rome, Julian sets up shop in Constantinople in 361, and immediately digging into legislation and cleansing out the imperial court, because the court was full of men who were corrupt and who had opposed Julian's every move previously. And so he set up something equivalent of our Doge. So they would go through and separate the wheat from the chaff and look into the imperial budget. So instead of burning the chaff like so many emperors before him, Julian exiled them and then focused on reforming Rome's religious policies, and started squashing the idea that the emperor was a living god, or that the emperor was an extension of God. So he's looking to take Rome in the opposite direction that Constantine took it. So Julian wore simple clothes and ate simple food and grew a philosopher's beard and worked towards bringing Rome back to its simple self by separating the church from the state. Did I have? There's Magnentius. No, sorry. I forgot to update that. That should say Julian. So that's Julian. So he put a lot of effort in separating church from state. He no longer kept his paganism a secret and instead worked obsessively to tear down the social political influence of the Catholic Church. Or as he would call them, the Galileans, because he used I think it's scripture Matthew, that out of Galilee comes no good prophet. So he kicked Christians out of the influential post, denied the church access to the imperial purse, and denied access to the emperor personally. He opened up buildings for pagan worship in Constantinople, and he would favor the hiring of atheists and pagans over Christians. In fact, he forced those who repurposed the old pagan temples he forced those who repurposed the old pagan temples to restore the structures back to, basically temples for the pagan gods. And it was to be done on their own dime. So he issued his infamous edict on religious tolerance. So that's why they call him Julian the Apostate. So he overturned anti-pagan laws implemented by Constantine and declared that all religions were now considered equal in the eyes of the government. So this meant that all the previously deemed heretics were free to come out of the woodwork. So Julian allowed all banished Christian bishops and factions to return. And don't be mistaken, this effort wasn't some attempt of any kind to, support those Christian sects who were deemed heretics. His primary goal was to introduce more competing factions in hopes to fracture the unifying Catholic Church through internal conflict. So this wasn't out of, a motivation to sympathize with those that were deemed heretics. It was to deunify the Catholic Church. So the Donatists, who were among the heretics, began reestablishing congregations in North Africa. So they never really left Africa after the pro-Nicene churches dominated the West. From historical writings, there's evidence that they had migrated to Syria, but that's really as far as the Donatists go. But now, instead of congregations meeting in homes and places outside the cities, they began taking back basilicas and properties that had been lost during Constantine and his son's rule. Writings also show that some Donatist congregations would organize and force their way through church doors in order to purge them, smashing altars and removing statues, arts, and icons. So they kind of went through initiative to re-purify the churches. So the Catholic Church took advantage of the Donatist actions by sending out declarations that the Donatist groups these groups that the Catholics called the Circumcellions, which were essentially gangs. So the church put out, statements that the Circumcellion groups were wandering the streets, attacking and sometimes killing Catholic opponents. So this effort of propaganda was ramped up by Aurelius, the Bishop of Carthage, in an effort to gain state support and push the Donatists out. So, just to kind of reword that. So the Donatists were again trying to repurify the church, and so they were pushing the Catholics out of the churches that they had occupied in Northern Africa, and started, destroying the altars, which we'll get into. What were the altars when I look at. I think next week we'll kind of do a parallel and look at some of the ordinances that had developed or changed up to this point. And so they would destroy the altars, clear out the church of all the statues and icons. And so the Catholic Church, in opposition, put out basically propaganda that they were actually, killing Catholics in this process. So in order to say, hey, state, you have this group of fanatics that are killing Catholics. Can you help us out here? Huh? Yep. That is a lie, though. But it's not the first time that the primary Christian movement, prior to the establishment of the Catholic Church, was lying about groups like the Donatists in order to discredit them. So I'll stop there. We're quarter till, so any comments or questions?
Where was the information coming from as far as the Donatists coming back into Northern Africa?
So the journal I've been reading, in the last, 20 years, they've unearthed additional letters that are not of Catholic origin, that give a different kind of narrative to what was going on with movements like the Donatists. Because up until then, it was widely accepted that, the Donatists were going through and killing Christians. Because obviously, most of the surviving documentation that we have from that period are from the Catholic Church and the primary Christian movement. So I tried to look for the hard part is finding the actual letters, I tried to use AI to see if it would pull those letters up for me, but Donatists aren't really the Anabaptists aren't really they're maybe not important enough yet to present their story on the internet. I don't know. There's limited information.
I was just kind of like trying to picture in my mind if you have a large organization that takes over an area and then the state's basically like, no, we're not endorsing this group anymore, so therefore it no longer ties itself with that organization, and then it allows other organizations basically to have equal opportunity to come back in.
Yeah.
I mean, would those groups that come back in, would they try to retake the properties that had been taken away from them? I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. I'd be speculating, but I could imagine there's, like any church, there could be a couple bad apples that, it probably may not have went as far as killing people, but would be motivated to take back what's been taken from them. I don't know. But yeah, this will lead to so yeah, the Julian basically ignored the ploys of the local government and the Catholic Church during this time, because this was essentially playing into his goal, disunity. He did not like the Catholic Church. He did not like the power it had over the people and its intermingling with the state. So this will lead to a schism after Julian passes, and the next emperor basically picks back up where Constantine and his sons left off. So the Donatists won't last long in their enjoyed freedom. So, and it eventually leads to, because up until this point, killing on the name of the Lord was very rare, but that'll start ramping up. Forced conversions, things like that. So, no, that's ways away. No, that's not for a while.
We're only like up to, we're not even up to 400 AD yet. Crusades don't come around till what, 1200?
Something around, yeah. I'd have to look again. But we are approaching the Council of Laodicea, which pastor's been going through talking about the book of Enoch, and the results of that council are primarily why the book of Enoch has been excluded from the canon, official canon. So, all right. There's one in Alexandria. I didn't write the name down. I can look that up. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's obviously the basilicas they were after weren't, because during Constantine's time, much grander churches were built throughout the empire. So I think the basilicas that the Donatists were reclaiming were, the insignificant structures that existed prior to Constantine. Okay.
Alexander, that would be in present day Egypt.
Yeah.
Well, any of those North African churches, a lot of that history would probably be lost when Islam would
Oh yeah.
start pushing through anyways.
Yeah.
It's probably right next to the library.
That was burned down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it probably also burned down along with the library.
And all the information that pertains